Good afternoon, evening, or morning to folks out there in Zoom Nation. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I'm the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, IRAAS-AAADS, here at Columbia. And I just want to begin by situating myself and the university on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape. We pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future rights and presence of the Lenni Lenape on their rightful homeland. And I want to begin just a little background. For the past 29 years, IRAAS, founded by the late Professor Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate for social responsibility in Black studies. Dr. Marable offered a prescient reminder in a 1989 New York Times article that, quote, Black studies must utilize history and culture as tools by which an oppressed people can transform their lives and the entire society. Scholars, he wrote, have an obligation not just to interpret, but to act, end quote. IRAAS serves as an academic resource center for a local and global community that has cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and New York City's rich history and culture. And now in partnership with our Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, we continue to expand the array of contemporary scholarship and interpretation of the diasporic Black experience, like this year's special series, Black Counter Cartographies, co-sponsored with the Institute for Comparative Literary Studies and the Center for Ethnicity and Race here at Columbia. Conceived with my invaluable colleague, Dr. Vanessa Agard-Jones, Black Counter Cartography brings together in dialogue geographers and artists, poets and architects in a series of conversations exploring the spatial practices of Black life across the diaspora and continent and how they construct what Mpho Matsipa calls counter cartographies of sociality, imagination, and liberation. Now, geographies encapsulate modernity's production of space and time, subjected to the metrics of market and politics. Within that sphere, the racialization of peoples of African descent has historically and continues to produce sites of abjection, extraction, exploitation, dispossession, and displacement. The field of Black geographies challenges these discursive formations and reimagines the cadences of everyday spatial practices. And so for our fifth conversation in the series, we couldn't think of two people whose work engages Black counter-cartographic spaces than scholar Shanya Cordis Brown and artist educator Tia-Simone Gardner. Joining me in this conversation is my colleague, Dr. Vanessa Agard-Jones, assistant professor of anthropology here at Columbia, where she is affiliated with the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender, and the Center for Science and Society. At its most expansive, Dr. Agard-Jones's work asks how coloniality is made material in social forms, in human and non-human bodies, and in the landscapes in which we live. With a focus on Black life in the Atlantic world, she conducts historical and ethnographic research on racialization, environmental crisis, and the politics of gender and sexuality. She is a 2005 MA graduate of IRAAS. Vanessa will now introduce Dr. Cordis and Dr. Gardner.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Dr. Wilson, and that beautiful framing of the project that we have afoot here. We are thrilled to welcome all of you to our space in Zoom Nation. And I am thrilled to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. Dr. Shanya Cordis is a first-generation Black and Indigenous Lakono and Waru Guyanese American. Dr. Cordis is assistant professor in African American and African Diaspora Studies and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. Her manuscript, Unsettling Geographies, Anti-Blackness, Gendered Violence, and Indigenous Dispossession in Guyana, is a critical feminist ethnography that tracks how geographies of racial difference undergird Indigenous recognition policies, extractive economies, and neocolonial capitalism, advancing the annexation of Indigenous territories and entrenching anti-Black logics. Dr. Tia-Simone Gardner is an artist and undisciplined Black geographer committed to the celebration of Black life. Dr. Gardner is Assistant Professor in Media and Cultural Studies at Macalester University. Working primarily with photography, moving image, and drawing, her practice is deeply grounded in interdisciplinary strategies that activate ideas of ritual, iconoclasm, and geography. She is currently working on a photographic/writing project with her mother that juxtaposes questions of biopolitics, Black Southern familial memory and geology with vignettes of extractive capitalism. Please, let's welcome them to our Zoom Nation space today.
And I will add that after presentations by Dr. Cordis, followed by Dr. Gardner, we'll have a conversation, then open it up with the Q&A toward the end of this event. So please post your questions in the question and answer window on Zoom. Okay, great. Yeah, and Shanya. I think Shanya first, then Tia-Simone.
Perfect. Can I go ahead and share my screen? Okay, great. So thanks, Dr. Wilson and Agard-Jones for the introduction. I'm just really excited to be in conversation with Dr. Gardner. We have connections, and I'm just really excited to hear more about your work and just talk more today. So part of this is emerging out of ongoing work and more recently ideas that I have for the second book project. So I'm doing a little bit of blending today in the presentation. So much of my work is emerging out of being a US-born Black and Indigenous daughter of the Guyanese diaspora. It's really funneled into a lot of my intellectual, creative, and communal work, interrogating the ways that relational geographies of difference, or what I've referred to as relational difference in my larger book project, illuminate how imperial and enduring colonial conditions continue to animate capitalist logics of extraction. And the kind of productions, how that happens in these very constitutively gendered and sexualized ways in Guyana. So specifically, I've traced how Black, Indian, and Indigenous communities have navigated the afterlives of colonial conquest, dispossession, indentureship, and slavery in the Guyanese context. And I've done this primarily through an intersectional analysis of looking at the kind of racial and sexual imaginaries that are placed onto the body, namely African, Amerindian, and Indian women, thinking about how gendered violence is relationally configured and central to colonial capitalist expansion as well. So by developing this kind of thinking of relational difference, I'm very much in conversation with activists and critical thinkers and very well-known thinkers of Andeye and Walter Rodney, who have really looked at the kind of structural forces of colonialism, how that continues to shape the post-independence Guyanese state beyond these kind of post-colonial remnants or ethno-nationalist political struggles, as we often so very much hear when we think about Guyana. And so I'm looking at 3 different snapshots, beginning with oil. I traveled to Guyana right before this talk, and I was afforded the opportunity with spring break and this renewed urgency in light of my grandmother's illness in the wake of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And so it was a unique opportunity to travel with my partner, who would be accompanying me to Guyana for the first time, and the chance to reconnect with family and friends since my last visit in 2019. And so that was the last official kind of ethnographic fieldwork that I did in 2019. And so in the almost 4 years in between, I've spent a significant amount of time maintaining those connections through other means, as have many others, some through screens and phones and social media posts, others through field notes and essays and my ever-present book manuscript, a kind of odd, disjointed intimacy that attempts to bring together multiple sites, embodied memories, and all of its complexities of living here and there and writing about multiple lives and stories specific to particular contexts and histories, while tracking the interconnected legacies of imperialism and colonialism. My brief visit took my partner and I to familiar sites, reintroduced to me through a desire to show different aspects of Guyanese life, and the remembering, right, that memories often soften with time and distance. And so one of these spaces included the National Museum in Guyana. It's located in the heart of Georgetown, which is the capital, and it's one of the original colonial buildings that were built in the mid-1800s under Dutch colonialism before transitioning to British rule. It was rebuilt after a disastrous fire that consumed much of the ethnological artifacts that it housed, including soils, native timber species, minerals, and fruit seeds. After a cursory introduction to the museum by the front desk receptionist and a stern reminder that photos of exhibits should be selective, we began on the second floor. The beginning of the multi-species exhibit displayed a diverse array of flora and fauna, taxidermized and on display in old wooden glass casings within replicas of the biodiverse natural habitats of Guyana. A relatively small building, we quickly made our way to the geological exhibits detailing the rich mineral composition of Guyana's interior hinterland with precious metals and stones, including a historical background that detailed the first gold shouts. And this is referencing the kind of moment that ushered in the gold rush that happened in the interior hinterland. On display, amidst other casings, detailed everyday colonial life, included mortar and pestle, pressing combs, flat irons, charcoal iron, milk cans, slingshots, so many various things that were collected over the years. And most interesting was a video recording playing a loop detailing the discovery of oil in 2015. And so in this photo here, you'll see on the right-hand side, the first oil pool, and it's the kind of marker at the bottom reads a sample of Liza Destiny crude oil. And on the left-hand side is a vessel that was supposedly of Persian origin and used by the Dutch to import oil to their Guyana or the Guyanese colonies. So the venture into oil is facilitated by Liza Unity, FPSO, and FPSO stands for Floating Production and Storage and Offloading Vessel. It's designed specifically to be used for offshore processing of oil and gas. Known as Liza Destiny, it is the length of 3 soccer fields and named as such for its location in the Liza oil field. The term Destiny was chosen in partnership with the government of Guyana, and it was meant to kind of signal this importance of a new energy industry and the potential significance of Guyana as a potential area of generating the good life for its citizens. So as the narrative goes, oil is not only a marker of forward development and progress for the nation, it is its destiny and history. The emergence of Guyana as a new petrostate in the region mimics earlier colonial imaginaries of Guyana as a space of extraction on multiple scales. So we're thinking about the hinterland or the bush, the plantation, and the bodies of enslaved, indentured, and dispossessed indigenous peoples. So Guyana's move toward becoming a petrostate in light of the kind of largest discovery of oil reserves this side of the hemisphere in 2015 has estimated or is estimated to generate revenues of 30 billion by 2030. And this is comparable to neighboring Venezuela. So this is the establishment, this next photo here, of the 6.6 million acre claim that is currently 120 miles offshore by ExxonMobil and a consortium of oil companies. Oil production officially began in late 2019. And so in May of the following year, the company increased its production targets and projected that it's going to produce about 1 million barrels of crude oil per day by 2027. So as of 2020, and even most recently, those projections have only skyrocketed. They've continued to increase over the years. And of course, this has sparked renewed U.S. interest in the country as an economic and political threshold in the region. So the kind of linkages between the development of the Guyanese oil and gas industry, the exercise of territorial sovereignty that we see happening in light of a reinvigorated border conflict with Venezuela in the wake of the oil discovery and ongoing land conflicts with indigenous communities is one that's deeply connected to Guyana's colonial legacies of dispossession. So this mirage of oil as the pathway to economic advancement for all reveals the kind of magnitude of this present historical moment of not a new crisis or a new development, but rather the central function of the state in collaboration with capital. And we only need to look to the hinterland and look to the extraction of gold, the very foundational aspect of that, to Guyana. So in 2015, at the same time that Guyana discovered oil in its foreshore, the Guyana Geology and Mines Commission, GGMC, came under intense scrutiny for its granting of vast mining properties exclusively intended for Guyanese to Baishan Lin, which is a Chinese mining company, which is a claim, of course, that the mining body has since contested. The Inception report that kind of reviewed this as of early 2015 showed that Baishan Lin's director, Chu Hongbo, was the third largest holder of medium-scale mining permits in Guyana, with 109 listed medium-scale properties and one of 4 people holding over 100 medium-scale permits. So this is quite expansive. Another analysis that was done that was looking at the revision of the Mining Act showed that revision was supposed to attract international mining companies while safeguarding national interests, but has actually been used to facilitate the concentration of mining concessions in the hands of very few nationals. So they've acquired over 75% of small scale and over 40% of medium scale concessions. So in addition, there is actually one individual that was noted as holding over 1,500 mining claims. So this is quite vast in the kind of scale that is happening here in the hinterland. So Hongbo's granting of citizenship sparked further scandal on whether or not the government was only granting citizenship to actually circumvent this mining act to facilitate the company's ventures into the mining sector. So it's actually facilitated further the expansion of landlordism. This is a practice of claim owners subleasing concentrated land holdings. And so it's created a tier system that's only exacerbated the kind of racialized geography of Guyana that positions Amerindians or indigenous communities in vulnerable and exploitative labor capacities in the mining sector, and has further exacerbated the fragmentation of indigenous land claims and territories. So you'll have many villages that continue to contend with competing mining claims that often overlap or efface their titled lands altogether. And this is not an anomaly that's happening in Guyana. So this imaginary of the frontier landscape marketed in tourist and economic development ventures as an undiscovered virgin territory, again, it's not new, it's not unique to Guyana, but its current iterations have significant implications for the lives that primarily inhabit the coastal landscape, with the potential for devastating ecological and environmental transformation and degradation. So this kind of image of the frontier and its associated ideas of wealth, of empty lands or terra nullius, and these kind of untamed lands and indigenous peoples, they've been the core impetus for colonialist expansion. We see the stealing of indigenous territories, the extraction of resources, that this is one of the kind of imaginaries that we see continuing to play out again and again and again. So this idea has also positioned indigenous peoples as being perceived as redemptive spaces and bodies that generate capitalist expansion. So I've been thinking about this more deeply and thinking about this in connection to this question of what to the dispossessed body is redress. Like, what does it mean for indigenous, African, and Indian peoples to assert place, connection to land in ways that exceed capitalist extraction, participation, and the kind of status framings of radical politics that is, for the most part in Guyana, been reduced to the political party. So in the same place of inheritances of these colonial legacies and these wounds, also may reside the potential and the possibility for other forms of relationality. So I want to bring it to a more personal connection for me and thinking about what has place meant for me and what has my return or my relationship to Guyana, what does that look like? In thinking about the kind of wounds my family carry in this project as well. So this is a photo of my great-grandmother. She passed in 2020. And this was a moment in which she was recounting to me my father's return home to our family's village in Northwest after having lived overseas for about 2 decades. And she shared how this moment was a fissure, was a rupture, not only for my father, but was a rupture for her as well. And so how in many ways, my kind of return or coming back, coming home, going home, that in many ways it was a bridge of healing or a possibility of healing. And so she shares a little bit more, and then I'm going to give a little bit of detail about it here. So part of our village is called Northwest, and toward the back of the village in the area they call the Back Dam, there's a family farm where my grandmother explained that they grew sweet and bitter cassava and other things like coffee. And so here in the photo, you see her grinding up the dried coffee. Her descriptions remain embedded in my memory. And here, it was just really a beautiful thing to see her share with me this aspect of our family's practices and our connections to land. So from my great-grandparents' home, there's an expansive stretch of forest, and it's interspersed with fruit trees and coconut trees, which descend into a valley before swelling in the distance. So there's a singular dirt road that cuts through the village up a steep hill, and it's wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. It's the only point of entry, and it's become a big problem in the rainy season where it becomes flooded. It's a very swampy area, and so it's often overflowed and makes transportation impossible. And so this kind of state of neglect of the village, again, is not unique to my family's community, but can be seen in other aspects and other territories in the hinterland. We have plenty land, she said, as she placed a piece of fruit in her mouth. She positioned in the distance, or pointed in the distance, her red polka dot dress hanging loosely on her frame, her short graying hair smooth flat against her head. From these coconut and pear trees all around till Hillfoot Bottom is we land. She stared ahead, not merely because her mind wandered between memories or overlapped with recounting the past and the present, but also because her eyes had gradually succumbed to incessant cataracts and a grayish blue film that permanently altered her once dark brown eyes. She reached in my direction. We don't have to buy meat. We don't have to buy fish because, well, your grandfather, he does hustle for all of them things. He goes to hunt and catch fish. Got his own boat and engine, but now pure shop. We have to go to the shop. She sighed, exasperated that the subsistence economy she had once obtained directly from the land to maintain her family's livelihood had been gradually displaced by the market economy of the shop. Food that was once cultivated in the region had become increasingly supplanted by food that was brought in from surrounding small townships like Mabaruma or the capital of Georgetown. And so that's quite a distance. And so oftentimes it meant that the prices were double. And so I had never had the chance to meet my grandfather. He passed before I could walk with him and listen to old time stories or visit the expansive farmlands he had tilled or hear about how my father had looked him in his eyes. Yet despite having passed along his presence seen throughout the house he had shared with my great-grandmother, marked in the landscape in place and in the use of the present tense when my grandfather spoke of him. In the archives in Georgetown, I had found his signature scrawled a petition for a land extension. Over the next few days, she shared with me spirit stories, revealing the ways death, the dead, and the living intertwined, and how the past and future informed present understandings of what it meant to be Waro and Lokono. She was from a specific place. In that identification, there was a whole host of histories, genealogies, and connections to a spatial memory. Specific places were not merely sites of the living, but part of a constellation of living histories. And so now I write this book in the wake of her passing, in the midst of an ongoing global pandemic that deeply impacts the most vulnerable, including the hardest hit regions of Guyana and the hinterland that were effectively cut off from urgently needed medical care. Her presence is an indomitable guiding force in the writing of this book, an ethical and political undertaking to illuminate the particular vulnerabilities her life and the wellspring of life she brought forth continues to navigate. Her story is particular, yet in many ways an ordinary, to use trio, unfolding of the violence of dispossession so integral to the project of modernity. And these geographic memories and places are living beings. During my visit to Guyana, this was made clear to me during a conversation with remigrants and returnees who are now living in Guyana, some under conditions of deportation, others seeking economic freedom from an oppressive US system, or the desire to return to their homes of parentage for the first time. It was clear that this was a movement of diaspora going and coming that's entangled and layered with the memories we carry and those that await us in the land. after engaging and laughter and gaffing on topics from the current political moment, the ongoing pandemic, to the possibilities of such a gathering, what that might generate, I was asked by the convener of the group what return to Guyana meant to me. I paused and shared, I don't think of it as return, but going home and coming home, however fraught and incomplete that may be. So thank you. And I look forward to the conversation in the Q&A and the open forum.
That was really beautiful. And I feel like there's so many connections that we share in thinking about space and geography and memory. And so I'm excited for this conversation. I'm gonna share a little bit of my work. I appreciate so much the invitation to come today and talk, like be in conversation with Shanya. And I'm having like so much fangirl for Dr. Vanessa and Dr. Mabel. So thank you all also for extending the invitation and facilitating this conversation. So before I start, I wanted to share a little bit. In 2013, I began to engage with what might be called a kind of undisciplined geography or an undisciplined geographic inquiry. Living in Minneapolis, I began to spend time with the Mississippi to think about its relationship to the Southeast, which is where I'm from. I'm from Alabama. And I would note that Alabama is outside of the Mississippi River's massive watershed. And still, I think about the proximities of Black populations, one to another in the upper Midwest and in the Southeast, and how the connective paths of the Mississippi River had historically created lines of flight for and against Black folks. These hydropolitical power networks made it possible to move human beings as goods downriver, and for some of those humans to enact what Catherine McKittrick terms rebellion, invention, and groove toward their liberation. Black life stories the Mississippi River in fiction, film, and philosophy, and I borrow from all of this to describe my practice of Black geographies. If we think about Blackness, objectness, and agency together, then we can think about the agency of the river, and even as it's been conscripted to unmake Black life, we've also seen it as a site of Black liberatory possession. So with that, I'll show you some work.
If you've ever been in one of our southern states, you may have taken a sightseeing trip. A trip to see one of the plantation homes that were built before the Civil War. This beautiful mansion is one of many homesteads that were once the residences of Southern planters. These homes were centers of plantation life. It was almost a little community by itself. Most of the sections of land were devoted to one crop, such as cotton.
The easiest means of travel was by riverboat, and so many plantations were located along the rivers. At the boat landing, manufactured goods from cities could be brought in. Crops grown on the plantation could be sent out.
Here is a scene that tells us part of the story.
So in my practice as an interdisciplinary artist, I think about Black play and Black pleasure in place. The landscape is a material world that Black folks know well, and I have, in relationship to the places I know or want to unknow, thought about what it is to mine and what it is mine to mine and what it is to mine.
I'm going to talk through some of the ways that I've built my work over time. The work that I will share comes from a particular kind of slowness that I was once very uncomfortable with, but now I try to work with it with some ease. And it's also grounded in research and a lot of collaboration. I think about representational structures and their relationship to geography, how structures like maps, satellite images, archival still and moving images have enabled and concealed extractive projects that changed and toxified our beloved places. So how then do we unsettle or break the pleasure of something like map-led self-direction or kind of scopophilia with landscape photography itself? I've tried to resist the desire to satisfy my formalized curiosities in a singular project, which you will see, since these kinds of larger political projects are changing and ongoing. So I engage iteration. I return again and again to a site, to collaborations with humans and non-humans, and to think about what drives our work together. So this is an image from a publication from the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, called The Calendar of Coercion. And this is not the Mississippi River, but rather a river in Mississippi. And they're searching for the bodies of Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. And why are they searching there? Because a part of US American river history is that they were used as mass graves. The Mississippi, the river that runs through the city I live in now, has a long and storied past. And the often quoted and late beloved Toni Morrison wrote, "You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places." Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding, it is remembering where it used to be. All water has perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. And we can think about the changes that have happened and been enacted across the Mississippi River landscape as particular kinds of industrial capitalist projects. And that a part of the ways that flooding happens and what Toni Morrison is talking about is the river reclaiming some of that landscape in ways that humans continue to try to fight to control. So in this video, I use a body camera. This was also in the previous video. And body cameras, as we know, are often used to surveil the Black body in landscapes. And what I decided to do was turn it away from myself towards this levee, which is also toward the soil. So in 2016, I began to look at the river, which is 2,500 miles from Minnesota to the Gulf, where fresh water meets salt water, or Yamaya and Oshun meet. And I was interested in how I could make images that allow the process of looking to extend our ability to read an environment. The river and the earth around it, like the levee seen there, are an archive, a repository of lives lived adjacent to it and the capitalist extraction projects that determined its utility. And so a part of the work that I've been doing since 2018 has been to try to think, how do you socialize something like photography, which is often an individual activity. And so in 2019, I was invited to be a part of something called Counter in Houston, Texas, which is a performance art festival, but I am not a performance artist. And so I decided to take some of the river work that I have been doing and see if we could make a floating project to get people on the river. I wanted to make a project, because it was a performance festival, that would be kind of self-animating and in and of itself a kind of performance. And so the camera obscura is what I came to, and it became that object that could perform. The camera obscura itself, for folks who may not be familiar, is it's a proto-photographic object. It's a darkened room with a small hole or lens at one side, through which light enters, and that small hole or aperture allows an image or causes an image of what's outside of the hole to be projected inside and upside down inside. So this is a camera obscura, and this is what it looks like inside of the camera obscura. And I thought about these spaces in relationship to things like holds of ships or attics or garrets in this kind of cinema box matrix. So instead of thinking only about these iterations of camera obscuras and cinematic boxes, I thought about spaces like this, which is Henry Box Brown mailing himself to freedom. Or I thought about spaces like this, and this one is an architectural drawing of Harriet Jacobs' grandmother's home that she writes about in her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And you may wonder, perhaps it's like very obvious, like what this has to do with the camera obscura. I think that it is a horrific intersection between race, the technical apparatus of photography, and architecture. Jonathan Beller writes, although there is no mention of cameras or photography in Harriet Jacobs' harrowing Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, within the narrative, a mechanism appears that I would hypothesize shares some aspects of the abstract machine that necessarily precedes the instantiation of concrete machines of photography. Jacobs, while under inconceivable physical duress, watched her own children grow up through a peephole she drilled in a shingle. In this social and technical construction, she observes her children through a camera obscura, unable to touch them, speak to them, or even let them know she was alive. So in this racist spectrometry, persons are measured by the biochemical light absorbing properties of their skin. And so I've thought about this, and this is us building the camera obscura in relationship to living in the Twin Cities alongside folklore and Black stories on water like Eagle Landing. And I was interested in using the architectural reference of an inverted ship, partly because of the sort of symbolic weight that it carries in relationship to the transatlantic slave trade, but also to river commerce and riverboats. And so this is another image of the camera obscura here. And this is the interior of the image that's projected as we move down the bayou inside the camera obscura. And it's, it is a floating cinema box that creates still and moving images, both from the movement along the river, but also caused by people moving around inside and adjacent to it. And it really pushed me to slow down. It pushed people to slow down, because in this darkened box, you have to wait for your eyes to adjust to darkness. It is an inverted way of seeing, and only by that slow waiting does the image emerge out of darkness. I learned a lot from that project, and it also caused a longing in me to go home. I am still in St. Paul, but I think about home frequently, which brings me to this project, which is it's kind of a play on words, but also like thinking about time, place, and anxiety. So chronotopophobias comes out of that. And it's me working with my mother in our hometown, which is Fairfield, Alabama. And that place that I grew up may not be as familiar or to people as its neighbor Birmingham. But that place, my home, was my first Black geography. And from that place, I learned to see and sense space. Between one place and another, between Alabama and Minnesota, I've tried to understand how space, not time alone, or capital H history, shapes human and non-human life. Proximities to clean water, proximities to toxic soil, proximity to trees or asphalt, then start to form the core of what I'm doing now. And so I will read a little bit from, I will read a little bit from something I've been writing that I've begun on this place. I grew up on a dead-end street, not realizing the larger meaning of this place, non-place, until I was older. It's strange, I think, but also hauntingly precise to call a place filled with so much Black life dead and ended. To be clear, ours was not a cul-de-sac, those outletless streets that bring up images of idyllic suburban landscapes. It seemed at the time that ours was an afterthought, the result of poor planning, a benign error. As an adult, I realized that nearly all of the streets in my nearly all Black part of the city were dead ends or led to dead ends, with only certain streets being used for entry and exit. This isn't suburban planning designed to maximize space, slow traffic, or delineate residential from other zoned uses. These dead ends are part of a racial temporal landmarking. The green barrier hedges seen here that repeat Black block by Black block are a visual, tactile color line. Charles Conley writes, Fairfield, my home, represents the ultimate expression of planned work communities, the iron and steel industry. The design for this model industrial city reflects the influence of the City Beautiful movement of the progressive era in the history of the United States. Extensive surviving planning documents detail goals of social engineering in their generous provisions for civic and green spaces. In the new city, while no expense was spared in the planning and construction of streets, parks, sidewalks, residences, and landscaping for this community, Fairfield housed only skilled white labor. And here I'm gonna share a little bit more from my writing, but also some of the work that I've been doing both in archives and in collecting. Birmingham is called the Magic City because unlike river cities that had some practical use, economic use attached to them where people could move goods and themselves around, or places that were quite fertile, like the Black Belt in Alabama. Birmingham comes out of a valley, and it's called the Magic City because of the material life of it, that you had iron ore, coal, and limestone in close proximity to one another. And once you have railroads, you can move that material efficiently through mining to plants where it can be forged into steel. And I think about that idea of magic and in these materials. So I've started to both photograph iron ore, coal, and iron ore, coal, and limestone, and return to some of the archives of U.S. Steel and Tennessee coal and iron. So just as the shift from agrarian systems to industrial ones were changing the social, racial, and material landscapes of the South, so too were the strategies of planning cities. Forms of discipline that had been tested on Black bodies living in varying degrees of freedom and unfreedom to deter interracial intimacy were now being tested on the landscape and built environment. In the new industrialized world, folks would no longer be separated by fields or plantations. They could, if unprohibited, be neighbors, sharing a connecting wall or waste facilities. Robert Jimison's white model industrial town, modeled after Gary, Indiana, was not a sundown town. Fairfield began with a kind of class division. Jimison wanted skilled white workers, not working class white workers or working class Black workers or low wage workers, which thus disqualified an entire Black workforce for a time. My town began as a sanctuary of sorts with an a priori color line. All that was within its borders would be white. The world beyond could manage its own rules. This was to be a utopia with fixed, impermeable borders, and this is how those color lines began. A spatial code. is separation imposed on any range of facilities, obstructing any form of human encounter and reordering life, land, and soil. When Jemison laid out our town, the original plan ended sharply just beyond a tree-lined residential street adjacent to the civic district, park, post office, town hall. This abrupt break became our part of the city. The Black side of town was there, but it was there in an unmapped blankness just beyond Jemison's terminated development. Fairfield could not just depend on metaphor for separation. Our town is small, and that closeness required creativity. In other places, color lines function and still function as markers of boundaries, but they could be spacious and ideological rather than sharp and intimate. Though folks may be tempted to synonymize the color line with a red line, these things are not one-to-one. Color lines, in the spacious sense, we might think of freeways or railways or dirt roads that become paved ones, but this was trees and soil and berms. And while I cannot erase the temporality of this place, of these lines, I don't actually want to. There's a part of me that feels more powerful in some ways for being able to live in out of sync with space and time because of knowing what's held in that landscape. And the years, of course, have marked this place in ways that are both obvious and elusive, but in case it needs to be said, life is still lived in Fairfield, above, below, and beside this barrier. It's temporary, and temporality is felt at human scales, not just as political decisions. This line has existed for 4 generations of my family's life and impacted each of us differently, a small blip in the fossil record. And while the line may someday disappear, I hope that no amount of reconfigurations of earth, ore, and water will ever undo our Black sense of place. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. What a fantastic set of papers and emergent conversation. Mabel, would you like to begin? Is there a question you're burning to pose? Or I also would like to offer that you all should feel free to pose questions to each other as part of this part of the conversation as well. I'm sorry, I jumped in. Mabel, is there something you wanted to?
I mean, I have some thoughts that are that are forming. I mean, just one observation that you both, particularly in the latter part of your projects, talk about your projects as ones of return. You know, Shanya, you talk about returning to the village, Tia-Simone, to your neighborhood and Fairfield. And I do want to maybe ask you both to consider that question, like, you know, since, you know, family is still there, you know, what does one do with redress or toward redress? And in what ways are you working through that in your respective projects? I know it's the question that Shanya, you brought up in your work, but I think it's also absolutely applicable to what Tia-Simone is thinking through, working through, and, you know, both amazing projects, very, very different histories, and yet nonetheless connected.
Yeah, I definitely, I see the resonances in our presentations and our work, the kinds of histories that we're navigating to, the way that they've reconfigured in the present moment, and how folks are trying to live livable lives in the current moment. I think for me, I think one of the questions, and towards the end of my presentation, it was interesting because in a conversation of folks who have lived in the diaspora, who either were born or raised there, we're coming back in part because Guyana has been actively trying to bring back folks in the diaspora to kind of develop and build up Guyana. And so in the conversation, this notion of return is one that has many meanings for folks. It's one that's quite messy too at the same time, and sometimes it can reproduce the kind of capitalist logics that actually has created those fractures to begin with. And in other ways, I think that it speaks to different types of redress that might not be in the political capital P, or these very political imaginaries that we have of what politics should look like. I feel like the invocation of memory, in embodied memory, invocation of memory in relationship to land, place, that is very much part of redress. And I see that articulated with these folks who are remigrants or returnees, as folks have named them. But I think for me, I've also had to think about this question in relationship to my project. I think about return as, again, at the end, I just kind of say, I've had to reframe it as a coming and going home, because there's a kind of a split that happens in thinking about return that doesn't quite capture what it is, what it feels like. So for me, I've had to think about the multiple places in which home resides, right? The multiplicity of those things for my families here in Guyana and here in the States. So that's how I would think about that question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'll say there's a lot of me and my mother grew up in the same literal house. Like my grandparents built their house, and then I grew up in that house after they had passed. And my mother moved in 2008, like just a few blocks away. But she moved into a neighborhood that they were like barred from, even though it was just a few blocks away when she was a child. And so I have thought many times about what does it mean for her to inhabit that house. And there's a lot that I feel an urgency about the work now, because my elders who raised me have passed, and my elders of my mother's generation are aging, and that's everything that they talk about now. And so the question of like, when are you coming home, is one that's like really urgent and very complicated, because financially it is like, like it would be as difficult for me to live there as it has been for them to live there. And I've been sort of like, I like, it brings me a lot of like hurt and anger, and like I have been thinking about, okay, well, what is the thing, like, what is the thing that can get you there? And like, how can I steal, I hope nobody from my school is here, but how can I steal time to go home doing research? So
Sounds like you're going to steal away from the planting.
Counter extraction, yes.
steal away home. Yes. Yeah. So I feel all of that, and like that is so I appreciate the question, and also like your thought, all of y'all's thoughtfulness around it. Yeah.
I mean, this tends to be the question that I pose in these conversations, but I think it's one of the ones that is so very important for our community of faculty and students. And it's a question about method, about your undisciplining, Tia-Simone, about the conversation with your great grandmother, Shanya. I want to hear you all talk aloud or reflect aloud a little bit about the kinds of methods that you've moved toward in your own work, either via what you've already shown us or kind of via reflection on where you were before. I think you each said a little something about kind of before I got to this place. I'd love to hear about your own journey and through your own undisciplining towards the Black Geographic. You both talked about developing the capacity to read environments, which I think is a tremendously important dimension of this kind of work. And so perhaps you could reflect on method and then through that, question, how you've each come to this mode of reading environment, so that our students who are in the room or who will listen to this conversation later can continue to mull over how they are going to work in and through place in their own work.
You want me to go? Okay. There's a couple things. Like, one thing that I have learned is asking a sideways question, because if you ask my mother, my uncle, a direct question, they will give you the most basic answer. And so knowing when to engage them and how to come indirect has been a skill that they've taught me. A part of that has to do with I think it has to do with a couple things. I think, they understand Birmingham as having lived there, and they understand Birmingham through the other ways that other people understand Birmingham. And sometimes me asking a question, they will give a static answer because the assumption is that already. And so I think the other piece of that is there is a lot of trauma in that landscape, as much as there is joy. And sometimes getting to the joy is asking them to be with you. You ask them, where did Miss So-and-so live when y'all were little? And they will take you on a whole story journey through a place. The video I showed is a drone video, actually, that me and my mother and a drone operator did together. And so she literally moved with us and guided us as we shot this thing and from above. And having her there, having her as a guide, let her tell some stories that I hadn't heard yet. And, she saw this place differently herself in the process. And so those have been some methods of working with them.
That's good. That sideways question is real. I feel like, the directness sometimes definitely feel that in the Guyanese context. So thinking about this question on method, I was trained as an activist anthropologist, coming out of the UT Austin school. And really, my initial orientation to the project was one of thinking about who are the kind of organized collective groups, right, in which I can be in collaboration with. So a collaborative approach to the research process from the inception of the project to its implementation, the kind of reporting back or engagement about what the analysis is. And all of that is very fraught and messy, right? Who's the collective, who's the community? Do they have a shared politics? Oftentimes they do not. So there's multiple levels that you have to kind of navigate. I think in the process of that, I have learned that there is as much to learn about the kinds of meanings and attachments that folks put onto what they do in collectives and as individuals and as members of particular communities and places. And they don't always line up. And so not making that assumption, I think, was really important for me in doing the work and continue to do the work. Another really important thing that is, I don't think unique to Guyana, but we call it gaffing, to gaff. Gaff is to have conversations about anything. It could be political, it could be about current news, it could be gossip, but it's sitting for hours with people and letting time and space and the kind of rhythm of things carry you through the conversation. And in those moments, I found that I have gotten the most generative, really beautiful engagement with folks about their stories and how they live and feel and think about things. So the gaffing part was really huge. I think my project is very much drawing on oral histories and really disrupting the idea that oral history is not a form of knowledge production. And so that's one thing that I think is really important for students who come in the classroom space and feel like they have to learn these very institutionalized methodologies, right? That we know we're trained in and we understand those things, but then there's something to be said for one's embodied knowledge and experience being part of the process and part of the project. And so I'm very intentional about oral histories and stories in general, storytelling. I see this work as very much about multiple storytelling aspects. So I think that those are some of the things I think about. Oh, the other thing is the transnational aspect of it, to really get students to think about, yes, the locality, the specificity of a location and its histories and how that has informed and shaped what's happening in a space. But there's always logics that are connected to imperial and transnational dynamics of power. Like, how is that also showing up in the space as well? Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I don't know if you guys want to ask questions of each other, but I just had one more question that I wanted to ask you both again, a kind of between this question of the transnational but also the intimacy of the local around the materiality, right? Because I think, Shanya, you showed us which I thought was a fascinating juxtaposition of the Dutch container of oil, the jar of oil, but also your descriptions that these everyday artifacts are also in the museum. And then you showed us this incredible photograph of your grandmother and the coffee. And I was thinking, as you described it, what was it that she grew locally? And how did she feel about those things when she no longer would get them local, right? So there's a kind of intimacy of the material. And the same, Tia-Simone, with you, about, that you're showing these kind of objects and the ways in which materials can also be archives as well. Right. So there's the spoken narrative, but there's also this kind of material, sort of presence of these things that also have, archival potential to also to speak, so to speak. Could be a comment, could be a question.
Yeah, I feel, it was very jarring for me and for my partner when we were walking through the exhibit and we're seeing all these things. Well, there is all these animals, right? And there's all these plants and then the minerals and the golds, and you get downstairs and then there's the colonial artifacts. They have like an old car and then there's this oil. And it's a very interesting, I think, it was for me, I think, an interesting moment in which it felt like a very ideological attempt and narrative attempt of the nation, the state, the government to say, this is part of who we are now. This is part of who we've been. And thinking about the kind of container of like what Dutch colonizers brought in terms of oil. So that was a very interesting juxtaposition for me. I think about that in relationship to the ways that folks feel about sugar, the way folks feel about rice in Guyana. Like those are things that folks are very much attached to their sense of identity, right? Their sense of who they are. We grow rice, we grow sugar. These are things that are part of just what it means to be Guyanese. There's a Guyanese-ness here. And so that kind of connection, I think, is really important. And the meanings that people map onto it is very interesting. But I think for me, what I've also noticed is the ways that the connections that we have to these material things can be manipulated, right? And have been mobilized by political parties for political patronage, right? That we support these industries in which rice, in which sugar, in which gold, in which oil is important to your well-being. And so we are going to give these concessions of things of sorts for the good life of Guyanese folks, but it actually kind of retrenches these very extractive logics that we see harming communities to begin with.
Yeah, I feel like I'm like in the middle of a thing. Like I've, been photographing these minerals and like pulling these images from U.S. Steel's archive. And I think that there's something more there. Like I think that there is a lot of like there's just like there's a lot that is like that grows out of the ground, that's buried, that are in stories that I have inherited, about what once was, like the way the historic landscape was. And I am still trying to figure out what is the right path towards that. Like, what's the right thing to hold that? I enjoy, having like an interdisciplinary practice, but it often means like waiting for the thing to reveal itself. And so I feel like I'm still like, I work with the material. Somebody described it kind of like having an Etsy shop. Like you work with the material and you just keep playing and then it crystallizes. And so, which is a part of just like being okay with that and having the capacity to do that. So yes, I think I'm still thinking about it.
So we do have some questions in the Q&A that I'd love to read for you. I'll read the two that are here because I think that they are perhaps connected. They're both from anonymous attendees. One is, what advice do you have for grad students who are trying to engage geography and cartography from fields like education or other social sciences? And another attendee is asking, what separates ethnography and geography? So I think these are questions about discipline and interdisciplinarity that build from what you've been talking about already, both of you. So perhaps you could reflect on these for our audience members.
Yeah, that first one is great. Like, what advice do you have for grad students? I think I would say, what about these fields are appealing? What about those fields are generative for your thinking? There's obviously something there in terms of what it could offer to the respective field that you're in. I'm not sure if you're in education or you're in social sciences, but for me, I'm an anthropologist by training, but I also am in conversation with Black studies, geography, Native Indigenous studies. And so there's many different, I'm not committed to a disciplined boundary around where thought and method comes from. And I think in that way, I think I've had to be, because Guyana is such a context that makes it difficult to do that. It makes it difficult to just have one set of a toolbox from this particular field or thought. And I've had to pull from many different avenues to be able to understand what is happening in the Guyanese context. And so, yeah, I think just think more deeply about what it is that you feel can contribute to your work and your thinking. I'm not committed to that kind of disciplinary boundaries of, purist thinking around what tools you can use and whatnot. I think it's quite generative and productive. So I would say lean into it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I'm just like reflecting on something Shanya and I were talking about, and I like thinking about this conversation, and like Shanya said, I won't say it as well as you did, but it was like, Black geographies is foundational to Black studies. And I think if we have like this beautiful history of interdisciplinary research, creativity within Black studies, Black geography is one, thread of that, rather than it being a wholly segregated, cordoned off discipline. That is one way to think about it. And I think to the second question, if we are thinking, I think that is a methodological question, because ethnography is a method, and we would say maybe we would say ethnography is a method, geography is a discipline. And I think, perhaps our work is trying to think of geography as a method. Yeah.
I mean,
I
I
have a,
was,
oh, go ahead. I have a
I was
question.
just gonna say, yeah,
Yeah.
I just want to say, just and maybe an answer to that question about ethnography in geography, I was thinking about Stephen Gregory's work and the ways in which I know, particularly in the later work that he was doing, he was still deeply invested in the conversations that both Tia-Simone and Shanya, that the intimacy of just talking to people and what you were. But also, I do think the discipline of geography helped him understand, particularly neoliberalism and these kinds of spatial relationships that he thought, were part and parcel of the kind of violence enacted through the isms of capitalisms and nationalisms, and et cetera, extractivisms. And so, there are people who have been kind of working with both those things. I think, in a while. I mean, Vanessa, you may know some other folks as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think of ethnography and geography as scalar partners. So if you kind of think of the intimacies of ethnography as a kind of, as a method, yes, that helps us understand social relations, everyday life, the ways that people understand the worlds around them and the worlds they make and the worlds they inhabit. Geography gives us some of the tools to scale outward or to scale inward, geologically even, to the environments that we inhabit. So I think there's geography gives us perhaps more of an infrastructure for thinking the political economic, as you're saying, Mabel, when we think about Stephen's work. But also geography gives us the tools to think beyond the social scientific, the literary, the humanist, to the scientific, in a way that I think is really exciting and interesting. And I was so struck by the intercut images of kind of rock types. I don't know exactly what I was seeing, Tia-Simone. I'd love to hear more about that in your visual essay. So yes, that would be what I'd contribute to that. But Tia-Simone, you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, I was actually gonna ask Shanya, and I can tell you about the minerals, but I was gonna ask Shanya, like, what has working with your family taught you about geography in the archive?
That's a good question. I think that working with my family has shown me all of the silences and the gaps and the erasures in the archive. And sometimes how those silences have been internalized in our communities, in terms of like shame or like feeling a sense of loss that one is culpable for, right? Instead of the multiple forms of dispossession that have created those conditions to begin with. And so, yeah, I think being in the archive in the moment in which I encountered an archival document that had my grandfather's signature on it was really deep. And I remember I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for the Amerindian Act policy, which is a land recognition policy for Indigenous folks in Guyana. And I just so happened to come across it in a random box that was unfiled. And that's how I came across it. And so it was these kind of like moments of surprise too in the archive that was really deep. And I mean, I know for folks who do archival work, talk and write about how painful it is, how it's deeply personal, and it's very heavy to do that work and to be in that space for a prolonged period of time. I think for me, doing it in relationship to my family's stories and in connection with them has been the thing that has sustained my work, has been the thing that has allowed me to return to these very weighty topics and not be so focused on abjection and exploitation and violence, because it's there, it's in it, and it cannot be ignored. But at the same time, like you were saying in your talk, like folks are still living their lives as much as possible. So for me, that's been one of the things I've wrestled with in the archive and with the work. I would love to hear that from you too. Like, what has that meant for you, working with your mother and your family and community?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I have a similar story about like this. My mom came with me to do a visit to the library's archives in Birmingham, and we were looking through surveyors' files to see we heard a rumor that a steel executive had built this house on the street where my mother lives now. Because it stands out, it's Tudor architecture, it doesn't belong. So we went to go look for surveyors' maps and building permits from when those houses were built, and we found the house she lives in now. There were two photos. One had a Black woman mopping off the front steps, and there was like a white child in the foreground of the image staring at the cameraman. Scrawled across that was the word void. And the second image, the surveyor had come back another day, took the photo with depeopled. And I have thought about like the juxtaposition of that. One, again, this was it was taken at the time when my mother and my family could not live in that neighborhood. So evidence, as we know, that in spite of these kind of color bars, there still is the the intimacy of interracial contact through labor. We absolutely knew that. And so that there is a Black presence in that place in spite of the kind of legal juridical policy that was in place at the time. And, and like, I think the void being scrawled across it had something that I can't quite name in it, but that you have, those were landscape photographs to me, because that's what they were doing. They're architectural renderings, but they're like landscape photographs, and like to sort of void the simple metaphor is like voiding Black folks out of the landscape. But there's something there. And like my mom, was very nonchalant about, well, of course that's, but I think like she, in her like dismissal of my shock, she probably wouldn't call it dismissal, but she there's something that she sort of taught me to like work with the surprise, work with the kind of surprises that come up in the research or in the studio. Yeah.
Are there other questions from our audience, our virtual audience? We still have a moment or two to put something in the Q&A box before we wrap for the evening.
Well, I had a thought question, comment. I think what was striking me about your presentation was the way that you were talking about the agency of the river. And I would really love to hear you talk more about that in relationship to Blackness, and like how are folks thinking about their relationship and their relationality to the river, and how is that showing up in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have here in the upper Midwest, we live with the river really differently than people in the South do. There is we are like flooding or a flood event is less, they happen here, but the Twin Cities won't experience a flood in the way New Orleans will. And so there's this constant interaction and like need for recognition between like what happens here. Things, it's not just like rainfall that swells the river, but snow melt, which we will have an immense amount of, like makes a different kind of climate event downriver. And I think, I've learned that, like this place, Minneapolis, St. Paul, it wasn't passed, but there was legislation like put on the table to make slavery temporarily legal during summers, because that's when people would come up river with people who they were enslaving. And it didn't pass, but the Dred Scott case happened because he was brought here to Fort Snelling. Him and Harriet Scott were brought here to Fort Snelling. And so there's like, I think about like what the river has been asked to do, what the river has been conscripted into doing. And I think about like how it carries us, like it's our drinking water. And something happened the other day with, like a potential pollutant in Monticello that people, they're like, it's fine, drink the water. And we're like, well, what's going to happen 2 months from now? And so like, there's a way in which like the river has a life of its own. It's dangerous and powerful. And yeah, we live with them. And next to that, there's a story in William Wells Brown's biography that he escaped enslavement because he was a river worker, but he also witnessed a woman drown. And so like I've been thinking about that. I swim, but I don't swim in the river. Partly because like it's toxic, it's dirty. But I want people to have water knowledge, because it's like this thing, we live with this place and have been strategically alienated from it across the Twin Cities and downriver, St. Louis, Memphis, like Ferguson, like that's on the Mississippi. It's just off the Mississippi in St. Louis. And like I there's so many Black folks who are river adjacent for lots of reasons, but I'm trying to like hold all of that in some of my work.
Wow, thank you. Thank you both. I mean, so much to think about in your respective projects. I mean, these are both incredibly rich. And it's really, fantastic how you sort of give us this sense of, the intimacy of everyday life, particularly through your dialogues with family, but also connecting it, I think, to these larger histories of colonialism, of nationalism, of distraction. As well. I don't know, Vanessa, if you want to say anything in closing before I do our
I would just like to offer
Mhm.
true appreciation, thanks to both of you for bringing your projects to our series, but also bringing yourselves to this space. I'm just so overjoyed that we had your conversation as a part of this series. So thank you.
Yeah. And I also want to just send out thanks also to I'm grateful for the brilliance of my colleague, Vanessa Edgar-Jones, without whom this series would not have been possible. And just thanks to our dedicated colleague, Sharon Harris, behind the scenes, who makes all of this possible. Thank you, Sharon. Also, Sean Mendoza and our IRAAS assistants, Olivia Pearson, James Jennings, who's been manning the jet, Josh Agubata, who are all essential in shaping today's event. Also, just some things coming up on April 4th, Kelly Jones, chair of AAADS, will be delivering the Hans Hoffman Lecture in Art History, also on April 6th. Our colleague Farah Griffin will be talking about her new publication, In Search of a Beautiful Freedom, New and Selected Essays, which will be at our local independent bookstore, Book Culture. And on April 7th is the last of our series in Black Counter Cartography with Eliza Kelly and Tanya Foster. So for more information about this and other events, please see our website, fmstudies.columbia.edu. And so I want to thank your audience for coming today and for your insightful questions. So thank you both. This was just fantastic.
Thank you so much for bringing us together. And thank you, Tia. I look forward to continue to be in conversation. And Vanessa, really appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's dynamite. All right,
Thank
take
you so much.
care. Be well.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.